If they're watching you but can't stop you, it means you've already surpassed their authority. You might want to sit down for this, because what you're about to hear isn't a conspiracy, it's confirmation. The whispers you've heard are real, the patterns you noticed weren't paranoia, and those strange synchronicities, they were never coincidences. You are being observed, not by a nosy neighbor or an ex still pretending to like your posts, but by top-level analysts, people with clearances, codes, and crisis briefings. People who don't even blink unless something or someone completely shatters their algorithm, and that someone was you. Now they're not just observing you, they're asking to meet you, to thank you in person. And let that sink in, because the real question isn't why they were watching, it's why they stopped fearing you and started respecting you. Here's a fact most people don't know. In classified behavioral studies, certain rare individuals, those with nonlinear soul responses, are flagged as anomalies. These are the people who don't react like the average population yet influence others without any direct contact. If that sounds familiar, it's because you, chosen one, are one of them. What they thought was a spiritual outlier turned out to be a divine anomaly. While you were healing, they were documenting. While you were praying, they were decoding. And while you thought no one saw you, you were the main event in rooms you didn't even know existed. You weren't crazy, you were classified, and now they don't want your silence, they want your blueprint. So let's talk about it. Number 1, you were flagged as a threat. Not because you were dangerous in the traditional sense, but because you were decoding what they couldn't. While most people moved through life on autopilot, you started asking questions no one wanted to answer. You saw patterns in dysfunction. You sensed lies hiding behind polished smiles. You picked up on what was never said and challenged what everyone else accepted without hesitation. That alone made you stand out in a way that could not be ignored. They didn't watch you the way they watched troublemakers. You weren't acting out, causing chaos or openly threatening systems. But your ability to uncover hidden truths and recognize the spiritual blueprints woven into everyday events made them deeply uncomfortable. You weren't supposed to see what you saw. Your insight didn't come from books or formal training. It wasn't taught, it was remembered. And the moment they realized you weren't learning the truth but recalling it from within, the game changed. You became more than just a curious observer. You were an untracked frequency, a walking key they couldn't place in any known dimension. Your stillness was unsettling, your awareness was provocative, and your ability to remain calm while seeing through illusions made you look like a glitch in their system, someone who wasn't just inside the matrix but quietly mapping it from within. They tried to study you, your behaviors, your relationships, your choices, but every time they thought they had you figured out, you moved in ways they couldn't predict. Where others crumbled under pressure, you went silent and recalibrated. Where most reacted emotionally, you responded with precision and strategy. They couldn't fit you into a psychological profile because your decisions weren't driven by fear, approval, or ego. They were rooted in spirit, and that terrified them. They weren't afraid you'd start a riot or blow something up. They were afraid your very presence would awaken people, that you'd make others question authority, question reality, and most dangerously, question themselves. And once that happens, control begins to crumble. You weren't unpredictable, you were uncontainable. They could trace your path but not your purpose, and that's why they flagged you, because you weren't just navigating the system, you were sent to expose it. Quick pause, family. If this message is resonating with your soul and you'd love to support this sacred work, you can buy me a coffee. It keeps this space flowing with truth, light, and divine clarity. The link is in the description, and drop the number 88 in the comments so I know you're here with me. Now let's keep going. Number 2, your inner purity completely distorted their surveillance metrics. These people weren't just casual onlookers, they were trained professionals. Their entire world revolved around detecting threats, tracking instability, and measuring deception. They relied on psychological models, behavioral algorithms, emotional response charts, and advanced systems designed to expose liars, manipulators, and fractured minds. But when they turned those tools on you, everything went sideways. You didn't fit any category they had prepared for. You weren't erratic, yet you weren't passive. You weren't angry, yet you weren't performing a fake sense of peace. You didn't chase attention, yet your presence drew it naturally. All the usual labels, trauma response, covert aggression, manipulative tendencies, slid right off you. They tried to force you into the framework, but the framework couldn't hold you. You weren't resisting their metrics, you were breaking them. What truly disrupted their entire system was the level of internal purity you carried. This wasn't about being flawless, it was about clarity. You weren't hiding agendas, seeking revenge, or masking your energy to fit in. And because you weren't projecting static, your frequency was unnervingly clear. Too clear. The more pure your signal, the more their technology and psychological assessments glitched. You didn't register as a potential problem, and you didn't carry the signature markers of deceit or disorder. Instead, you pulsed like something they had no training to interpret, something sacred. At first, they assumed the data was faulty. Maybe the software was lagging. Maybe you were pretending. But the longer they watched, the more their confidence cracked. You weren't performing, you were aligned. And that unnerved them more than any tantrum or public outburst ever could. They were looking for dysfunction, but all they found was depth. They were trained to spot fakes, but you kept showing up as the real thing. They expected a soul twisted by pain, bitterness, or ego. Instead, they saw someone who had burned through all of that and emerged whole. That's when the whispers began. That's when the air in the room changed. Someone finally spoke the truth no one wanted to say aloud. This one isn't from here. You weren't just misunderstood, you were classified. You weren't a subject to observe, you were a sign, and the very purity they didn't believe could exist had just shattered everything they thought they knew. Number 3, they mistook you for a pawn until you moved like a king. At first glance, you seemed easy to overlook, someone they thought could be shifted around, discarded without consequence. You didn't wear credentials that screamed power. You weren't part of their elite circles, and you didn't speak in their polished, scripted language. You didn't flaunt status, drop names, or posture like a threat. So they assumed you were just another piece on the board, there to be moved, manipulated, or ignored. What they didn't realize was that you were playing an entirely different game. Their world runs on control, labels, roles, and predictable pathways. Pawns move one square at a time, slow and cautious. That's what they expected from you, but your movements didn't match their design. Your decisions weren't reactionary, your silence wasn't submission, your calm wasn't confusion. Every action you took was deliberate, precise, and deeply intentional, and it rattled the people who thought you were beneath their radar. Pawns don't think for themselves. Pawns don't question the board. Pawns don't shift the energy of a room by simply standing still. But you did, all the time. You didn't need a title to hold authority. You didn't need permission to carry power. You didn't need visibility to ignite a revolution. You moved like someone guided by something far higher than human influence, and that became undeniable. They started comparing notes, trying to figure out how you always stayed 5 steps ahead. They thought they were watching someone small. Instead, they were watching someone sovereign. You weren't reacting to the system. You were responding to divine intelligence. That's not something they can model, predict, or contain. It's not artificial. It's ancestral. You were never part of their simulation. You came to overwrite it quietly and thoroughly. With every wound you healed, every moment you refused to break, every truth you spoke when silence was safer, you altered the structure itself. You weren't just disrupting the pattern, you were rewriting the entire paradigm they operate in. And now they're starting to understand their biggest miscalculation. The pawn they thought they could control has revealed himself as the king they cannot stop. And perhaps the most dangerous part, you never needed their board at all. You are the game. Number 4. Your trauma was their test bed, but your healing became the revelation. What you went through was never just personal. It was studied, quietly monitored, documented, and measured like a living data stream. You weren't simply left to suffer. You were placed under an invisible microscope. They wanted to see what prolonged emotional warfare would do to someone like you. How many betrayals would it take to crush a pure heart? How much isolation before a soul collapses inward? They didn't step in because they weren't there to help. They were there to watch you break. They tracked the moments you were abandoned. They recorded the times you were lied about, mocked, overlooked, and forgotten. Every breakdown, every panic, every desperate cry for help that went unanswered, it all went into their silent log. Not out of concern, but for pattern analysis. To them you were never simply a survivor, you were a test subject, a walking experiment. And they believed they knew the ending because in their minds, trauma always wins. But then the unexpected happened. You didn't just endure, you evolved. You stopped asking why and started deciding how. How to heal, how to rise, how to reclaim everything that once tried to destroy you. And the deeper you went into yourself, the more you shifted the very energy of the space around you. Your healing broke their logic. Their models didn't account for redemption. Their charts couldn't calculate grace. You weren't supposed to come back stronger, clearer, and infinitely more dangerous in your stillness, but you did, and that changed everything. They stopped documenting your breakdowns because there were no more breakdowns to record. Instead, you were breaking open, cracked but conscious, fragile but fierce. That made you untouchable in a way they couldn't explain. The experiment had turned on them. The observer had become the student. You became the blueprint. You weren't healing just for yourself. Every scar you turned into wisdom, every trigger you transformed into self-awareness, sent out a signal into the unseen. Something ancient and eternal awakened in you, and the people who once studied your wounds began to see something sacred in your recovery. Reverence replaced ridicule, fear replaced indifference, because in a world that profits from brokenness, your wholeness became the most dangerous anomaly of all. Number 5. You walked through traps designed for 99 to fail. You didn't just survive what happened. You moved through a battlefield engineered for almost everyone else to lose. None of your pain was random. The obstacles weren't natural. They were strategically placed like slow-motion landmines, psychological warfare, energetic blockages, social sabotage, invisible setups meant to fracture your mind, your identity, and your spirit. Most people would have collapsed under half of it, and that's the truth. These weren't random hardships, they were patterns repeated intentionally. People were planted in your life to break you, opportunities were dangled just out of reach to tear open your deepest wounds. Even the silence, the isolation, the rejection, the gaslighting, it was all part of a hidden design to make you question your worth, to push you towards self-destruction. But you didn't take the bait. You kept walking, slowly, painfully but forward. You crossed thresholds you were never meant to touch. You survived traps meant to hollow you out completely, and now the architects of this system are speechless because they've run the same test countless times, and only a rare few ever emerge whole. They timed your attacks for when you were weakest. They counted on your silence. They expected your collapse, but you kept breathing, kept listening to your inner compass, kept rising. And here's what they didn't see coming. Your endurance wasn't fueled by ego or desperation. It was powered by divine intelligence, something far beyond their reach or control. Now they're left asking questions they don't want the answers to. How did you see through their illusions? How did you guard your mind when the entire world was designed to distort it? How did you keep your soul untainted in a system built to stain it? They called you a subject, a scenario, a case study. But the truth, you weren't just being tested, you were exposing the test itself. You didn't beat the system by playing their game, you dismantled it by refusing to become what it demanded, and that's why they're stunned. You didn't just survive, you walked straight through their traps and emerged as living proof that the blueprint can be broken. Number 6. They tracked you for patterns, but what they found was a frequency. At first they expected you to be like everyone else, simple, predictable, chartable. They searched for cycles, triggers, habits, emotional reactions. They wanted to map you like a machine to find your weakness, your routine, your breaking point. That's how they've always worked. Locate the rhythm, exploit it, neutralize it. But with you nothing fit. What they found wasn't a pattern, it was a transmission. You didn't move according to the logic they could define. You didn't respond to pressure the way they were trained to expect. Your choices were often subtle, almost quiet. Yet they carried a disruptive weight that shifted entire rooms. You could walk into a space without speaking and still alter its atmosphere. People around you would change, tension would rise, or a deep, unexplainable peace would settle in. Even their equipment reacted. Technology glitched, devices malfunctioned, sensors spiked, surveillance feeds became inconsistent whenever you were near. Their tools were built to detect lies, predict rebellion, and track psychological decline. But none of that prepared them for someone whose influence wasn't behavioral, it was energetic. You didn't ping as a threat because of what you did, you resonated as a force because of what you carried. Your peace wasn't passivity, your restraint wasn't fear, and your authority didn't come from fighting for control, it came from obeying a code they couldn't access, something ancient, something exact. They began to realize you weren't malfunctioning, you were interfering, not accidentally but with precision. Your very presence contradicted everything their systems were designed to suppress, and slowly they stopped looking for flaws in you and started analyzing the signal itself, because it wasn't about actions anymore, it was about the broadcast. A frequency too pure, too sharp, too alive to be man-made. They understood then you weren't a part of their equation, you were rewriting it. Number 7. Their intel was never enough. They had to watch your spirit in motion. Their technology was advanced, their surveillance was precise. They knew your location history, your search habits, your tone of voice on phone calls, even the micro-expressions you made under stress. They tracked your patterns, your sleep, your preferences, your relationships. On paper, they believed they had you completely figured out, but something kept slipping through. It wasn't your behavior that defied their understanding, it was your being. They could watch your outer life endlessly, but your inner world held the real mystery. Your spirit moved in ways they couldn't decode. There were times when you broke down, yet even your breakdowns radiated strength. When you wept, it didn't weaken the room, it shifted. Grief became holy, silence became electric. You weren't just surviving pain, you were transmitting something through it, something sacred, something undeniable. When you prayed, things happened, not in theory, literally. Environments shifted, outcomes reversed. The chains that bind most people simply didn't hold you. You didn't chase influence, yet influence surrounded you. People were drawn to you, without knowing why. Even in stillness, you carried a quiet authority that could change the entire flow of a room. That's when they realized their intel was limited. They could record what you did, but not why it worked. They could measure your steps, but not the force guiding them. They could watch you every day and still never capture the power behind your presence, because this wasn't charisma, this wasn't strategy, this wasn't psychology, this was spirit. You weren't just a person anymore, you were an event, a moment in time they couldn't predict, a variable they couldn't program for. They couldn't replicate what you carried, and they couldn't reverse engineer your movements. You weren't operating from instinct or manipulation, you were moving under orders from something higher. And now they want to meet you, not for more data, but because the data failed. They saw everything except the one thing that mattered most. The energy behind your eyes, the conviction in your stillness, the presence that doesn't need to announce itself but still takes over the room. Watching from a distance was no longer enough. They want to feel what they could never define. Number 8. You were the case study that broke the algorithm. You weren't just living your life, you were being monitored as a long-term experiment. A file quietly marked and tucked away behind closed doors. They ran simulations on you, testing how long it would take for a soul to fracture under relentless spiritual pressure. They wanted to know how trauma, poverty, betrayal, emotional abandonment, and societal manipulation could hollow a person from the inside out. Their entire model was built on one unshakable belief that spiritual decay was inevitable. In their minds, if they stripped away enough support, manufactured enough chaos, and kept you in a constant state of pressure, you'd eventually collapse. That's what the data predicted. But instead of spiraling into the self-destruction they were counting on, you began to wake up. You didn't just resist the breakdown, you activated something higher, something older than memory, something they didn't believe still existed in this age. They saw it in your emotional resilience, in your ability to stay grounded in madness, in the clarity you carried in moments designed to confuse you. You didn't lose yourself in the darkness, you located yourself there, and that's what broke their algorithm. You weren't supposed to survive the environment they placed you in. Spiritually, it was toxic, energetically polluted, emotionally unsafe, psychologically rigged. But while others absorbed the poison and became twisted by the system, you took in the pressure and transmuted it into power. You found God in the gutters, you found clarity in chaos. You claimed your crown in the very place they built to bury you, and now the conversation in those quiet rooms has shifted. They're not just watching anymore, they're rethinking everything. Your case didn't just throw off their numbers, it shattered the foundation of the model itself. The data can't explain why you didn't conform, why you didn't surrender, why you didn't implode, why you didn't sell your soul or beg for escape. You made it through hell with your spirit intact. And more than that, you ascended from it. You didn't just survive the test, you turned the test into testimony. You became the living proof that spiritual activation can happen anywhere. Walked away from manipulation without explanation. You were starting a revolution not with noise but with nerve. They were trained to identify loud threats. They were prepared for explosive chaos. They expected challengers to arrive with fire and fury. But your challenge came in the form of stillness. You weren't looking for war, but you would never hand over your soul in exchange for comfort. And that shook them, because systems of control don't know what to do with internal freedom. They rely on external compliance, on fear, on confusion, on the desperate need for approval. But you refused to play. You didn't shout, yet you didn't flinch. And in a world built on manipulation, that kind of quiet defiance is louder than any protest. You began making choices that put your spirit first. You stepped away from toxic roles. You stopped taking the bait. You turned down money that came with invisible chains. You said no without explanation. That level of sovereignty is dangerous in a system built on submission. It spreads. It wakes others up. They expected an explosion. Instead, you gave them erosion. Slow, steady, undeniable. You didn't try to topple the entire pyramid. You simply refused to sit in the seat they assigned you. And because you stood your ground without screaming, they couldn't brand you as a threat. So they had to call you something else. And what they saw wasn't an enemy. It was a solution, not because you fixed their system, but because you proved it could be bypassed. You became the living evidence that personal sovereignty is possible under pressure, under surveillance, even in complete silence. You weren't resisting the system with rage. You were overriding it with alignment. And that isn't just rebellion, that's revolution. Tactical, spiritual, unstoppable. Number 10. You spoke to the masses, but your voice pierced their boardrooms. You never set out to go viral. You weren't chasing fame, validation, or the spotlight. You weren't shouting to be heard. You were simply speaking from truth. Whether it came through a quiet post, a heartfelt message, a whispered prayer, or a passing thought breathed into the silence, you released what was real. At first, it looked like nothing extraordinary, just a few people resonating here and there, a small following, a subtle ripple. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. Your words began traveling into rooms you'd never stepped foot in. People with clearance badges, closed-door agendas, and confidential reports were suddenly pausing to listen. They didn't always know why, but they could feel the weight in your voice. Something in what you said bypassed the noise, cut through the surface, and struck the layer where truth lives. At first they dismissed it. Maybe it was poetic, maybe you were lucky. But then your words started aligning with real-time events. Things you wrote in metaphor began to unfold in the physical world. Things you prayed over in private began to shift public structures. You weren't just insightful, you were ahead. They began comparing timestamps, cross-referencing your content with their reports. And the unnerving part, you weren't connected to anyone on the inside. Yet you were speaking as if you'd sat in the meeting room. That's when the tone shifted. You were no longer just a voice. They classified you as a signal, and the higher-ups began to understand something most of the world still doesn't see. Your words weren't poetic, they were predictive. You weren't guessing, you were broadcasting, and the source of your knowledge wasn't political, academic, or human. It was divine. They couldn't trace where your insight came from because it didn't come from anywhere they controlled. You weren't following trends or repeating theories. You were carrying a frequency of knowing, the kind that unsettles those who rely on control. Number 11. What they thought was natural intelligence turned out to be divine uploads. You believed you were simply speaking from the heart, but your words were pulling veils off things hidden from almost everyone. You weren't addressing them directly, but your truth still found its way to them, and now they're not just listening, they're watching you closely. They couldn't explain it. You didn't have the credentials they respected. No prestigious degrees, no elite connections, no formal training. You weren't part of their networks or institutions, and yet somehow you knew, not just surface-level facts, but deep layered truth. The kind of truth that makes people stop mid-sentence and ask, how do they know that? You spoke about events that hadn't yet happened. You called out strategies before they were executed. You responded to attacks before they were even made public, and you didn't speculate. You spoke with authority. That alone shook them. In their world, knowledge has a trail. If you know something, it's because someone told you. That's the rule. But with you, there were no leaks, no informants, no wires, no briefings, just you in stillness, writing, speaking, praying, revealing. They tried to write it off as intuition or quick learning, but the consistency dismantled that excuse. This wasn't coincidence, it was too exact, too timely, too clean. That's when it hit them. What they were seeing wasn't intelligence, it was revelation. You were plugged into a frequency they couldn't map, a higher dimension of wisdom they couldn't infiltrate. You weren't being informed, you were being downloaded, and the data you carried didn't exist in any of their archives. That's what made you dangerous and invaluable. So they started asking different questions, not what do you know, but how do you know it? Who was feeding you this insight? What channel were you tuned into? And more importantly, could they reach it too? They realized you weren't operating on education, you were moving with activation. Your knowledge wasn't studied, it was received. And now the same people who once ignored you are tracking your every step, trying to catch the signal before your next word drops. They no longer just want to understand you, they want access. They want to stand in the frequency you stand in. Because in a world drowning in information, your revelation is the only thing left that still moves power. Number 12. You undermine entire institutions without lifting a finger. Your existence itself became the contradiction they couldn't explain. By their calculations, someone with your level of trauma, rejection, isolation and sabotage should have collapsed, lost your mind, drowned in bitterness or disappeared into silence. But you didn't. You stayed rooted, you stayed kind, you stayed awake, and that single choice disrupted everything they thought they knew. Because institutions, especially those built on control, don't truly fear loud resistance. They're prepared for protests, for public outrage, for people screaming in the streets. What they fear is proof that their power doesn't work, and you became that proof. Every time you smiled when they expected you to shut down, every time you chose forgiveness when revenge would have been easier, every time you held your integrity in situations engineered to crush it, you sent a dangerous message. Spiritual authority outranks institutional force. You became walking evidence that healing is possible without permission, without access, without their approval. You proved that peace can be created from within, that it doesn't have to be granted by systems, by status, or by validation. You weren't supposed to become whole, you weren't supposed to become clear, but you did. And that alone started dismantling their decades of research, discrediting their psychological predictions, and shattering their carefully curated narratives about trauma, resilience, and identity. They tried to reduce you to a number, a statistic, a file on a desk, but you kept rising without the support they claimed was essential, without handouts, without shortcuts. And that's what made them truly pay attention, not because you were loud, but because you were unshakably whole in a system designed to break you apart. You weren't just surviving oppression, you were outgrowing it. And in doing so, you didn't just challenge one institution, you shook the foundation of the entire idea that human potential can be controlled, measured, or predicted. That's why eyes turned. That's why whispers began in rooms you'll never step into. Because you didn't just beat the odds, you made the odds look irrelevant. That's all for today. Dear Father, I pray for the growth of my faith. Help me trust you even when physical evidence is lacking. Let me believe in your perpetual presence, knowing you will never harm me. I understand that your thoughts for me are thoughts of prosperity and not harm, to give me a good future. Thank you, gracious and eternal Father, for always listening to my voice. I offer up this prayer to you in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you, Jesus, for your love and provision. I am grateful for your presence in my life and the abundance you bring. If this video resonated with you, please like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with those who need to hear this message. Leave a comment below about your journey and how you are preparing for your own triumphant return. If you'd like to support our work, please consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. This helps us continually improve our content to offer you the best. The link to buy me a coffee is in the description. No gift is too small, whether it's a penny, a prayer, or a share. Your generosity helps spread God's word and brings hope to others. Don't stop here. Watch our next video for powerful revelations about the signs that reveal you are the chosen one. We've enjoyed following this spiritual journey with you. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Keep shining brightly and embrace your destiny with courage. See you next time. Blessings to all the beautiful souls from the